She was fired for being too reckless to fly. 4 years later, she was checking bags at an airport counter, until a dying C-17 called for help with nowhere left to land. What she did next with nothing but a radio and a highway will leave you speechless. Watch till the end. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Elena Vasquez earned her wings at 23, the youngest officer in her class to be certified on heavy transport aircraft. By 29 she had more C-17 flight hours than pilots a decade older than her, and a reputation that split the base cleanly in two. Half the squadron thought she was the most gifted aviator they'd ever flown with. The other half thought she was a disaster waiting to happen. Both halves were right, in their own way. Elena didn't fly by the book so much as she flew through it, past it, and occasionally straight over it. When turbulence forced other pilots to abort approaches, Elena found a seam in the storm and threaded it. When an engine flamed out on a supply run over the Hindu Kush, she didn't divert to the nearest strip like protocol demanded, she flew the wounded aircraft another 40 minutes to the base that actually had the parts and personnel to fix it properly, saving the Air Force 2 weeks and $500,000 in emergency repairs. Her commanding officer at the time, Colonel Whitfield, used to say Elena had instincts you can't teach and nerves you shouldn't have. It wasn't meant as a compliment. The end of Elena's flying career came on a resupply mission into a forward base in a mountainous region where the primary airstrip had just been shelled. She was carrying medical supplies and 2 badly wounded soldiers who needed surgical care within hours, not days. The official approach to the secondary strip required a wide, sweeping turn around a ridge line, safe, standard, and 40 extra minutes she didn't have. Elena took the direct route instead. A narrow valley approach that put her aircraft dangerously close to rock walls on both sides, flying lower and slower than any C-17 pilot had reason to attempt in that terrain. She landed with less than 100 feet of clearance from a granite outcrop that wasn't marked on any chart she'd been given. Both wounded soldiers made it into surgery in time. Both survived. Elena did not. The investigation that followed didn't dispute that lives had been saved. It disputed everything else. She had deviated from a filed flight plan without authorization. She had flown below minimum safe altitude in mountainous terrain. She had, in the words of the final report, demonstrated a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the disciplined judgment required of a commissioned pilot of large aircraft. 3 other incidents from her file were dredged up to support the case, moments where her improvisation had worked brilliantly, but where a different pilot with worse instincts might have gotten everyone killed trying the same thing. You have to understand, Colonel Whitfield told her, not unkindly, on the day her flight status was suspended, it's not about whether you're good enough to pull it off. It's about whether the next person who tries to fly the way you fly is good enough. We can't build a training pipeline around exceptions. Elena was quietly discharged 11 weeks later. No court-martial, no headlines, just a general discharge under honorable conditions, a euphemism that meant we don't want you, but we can't quite call you the villain either. Her flight certifications were suspended pending review. The review never happened. Nobody scheduled it, and nobody ever would, because in the eyes of the institution she'd served for 11 years, the case was already closed. Commercial airlines wouldn't touch her. Every application asked about her separation from service, and every honest answer ended the conversation before it started. Regional cargo companies were more willing to overlook it, until they weren't, until somebody did a background check and found the word reckless buried in a report that Elena had never even been allowed to read in full. So Elena Vasquez, who had once threaded a 100-ton aircraft through a mountain pass with wounded men bleeding in the cargo hold, took a job checking bags at Denver's regional terminal. It paid the bills. It kept her near airplanes, even if she could only watch them from behind a counter. 4 years is a long time to watch other people fly. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment 11 minutes from the airport, close enough to hear the engines on final approach if she left her window cracked at night. Her sister told her, gently and often, that it might be time to let go of aviation altogether, retrain, go back to school, build something new. Elena always said she would think about it. She never did. The other counter-agents knew pieces of her story, the way people always know pieces of a story that's bigger than the person telling it. Some treated her like a minor celebrity, the pilot who almost got someone killed doing something incredible. Others treated her like she was one bad decision away from doing something incredible and terrible again. Nobody treated her like just a person who used to fly airplanes for a living. Her supervisor, a soft-spoken man named Desmond Okafor who had washed out of flight school himself 20 years earlier for reasons he never fully explained, was the only one who never brought it up unless she did. "You ever miss it?" he asked her once, on a slow Tuesday shift with nothing but empty gates stretching out beyond the glass. "Every day," Elena said. "Not the flying part. The being trusted part." Desmond didn't have a good answer for that. Nobody ever did. There were smaller humiliations too, the kind that never made it into any story about her but that wore at her all the same. The time a young captain recognized her name off a boarding pass and asked, half joking, half serious, whether she was the Vasquez, and then, without waiting for an answer, steered his family to a different line. The time a training video for new hires used an anonymized version of her mountain pass incident as an example of decision-making failures under pressure, and she had to sit in a fluorescent-lit break room and watch her own life narrated back to her as a cautionary tale by a voice actor who had no idea what those two soldiers' names were. She kept a small spiral notebook in her apartment, the kind she used to use for pre-flight checklists, and some nights she still wrote in it, not flight plans anymore, just numbers. Hours logged. Aircraft systems. Emergency procedures she'd memorized so long ago they had become part of her nervous system, procedures she rehearsed silently while scanning boarding passes so that some part of her brain, at least, still belonged to the sky. Her sister Camila visited twice a year, and every visit ended roughly the same way, a gentle, well-meaning conversation at Elena's kitchen table about moving on, about applying to nursing school or logistics management or literally anything that didn't require explaining a discharge to a hiring committee. "You were a pilot for 11 years, Elena. You can be something else." "I am something else," Elena said, the last time Camila brought it up. "I'm just something else that still knows how to fly a C-17 better than almost anybody on this continent, and nobody will let me prove it." Camila didn't have an answer for that either. Nobody ever did. The years compressed the way years do when nothing changes, not slowly, exactly, but in a long gray blur punctuated by the occasional sharp memory that cut through, unbidden, at the worst times. The smell of jet fuel on a rainy tarmac. The particular shudder of a C-17's airframe at cruising altitude. The sound of a wounded soldier's breathing evening out once the aircraft finally leveled off. Elena carried all of it behind a ticket counter in Denver, checking bags, printing boarding passes, and watching, every single day, as other people boarded planes she used to command. It was a gray Thursday afternoon in late October when the terminal's overhead monitors began flickering with alerts, and every phone behind the counter started buzzing at once. Elena was midway through checking an elderly couple's luggage for a flight to Phoenix when the airport's emergency broadcast system crackled to life overhead. "Attention all personnel. This is not a drill. We are tracking a declared in-flight emergency inbound to the region. All available ground and operations staff report to designated emergency stations immediately." Elena's stomach dropped the way it always did at the words in-flight emergency, an old reflex from a career she'd never quite stopped living inside her own head. She finished the boarding pass in front of her with hands that had gone slightly numb, told the couple to have a safe flight, and looked up to find Desmond already jogging toward her. "Vasquez. You need to hear this." He led her into the small operations office behind the ticket counters, where a radio scanner usually used to monitor ground traffic was now picking up chatter on the regional emergency frequency. A controller's voice, tight and clipped with adrenaline, filled the small room. "Repeat, we have a military C-17 declaring an emergency, multiple systems failures, requesting immediate diversion, unable to confirm they can maintain controlled flight to any prepared runway in range." Elena went still. "A C-17, she said quietly. What kind of failures? Desmond shook his head. I don't know. I just know every controller on this frequency sounds like they're about to lose an airplane. Elena grabbed the office phone before she'd fully decided to. She dialed the direct line to the regional air traffic facility, a number she still remembered from a joint training exercise years earlier, back when people in that building still knew her name for the right reasons. Denver Center, this is a restricted operations line. This is Elena Vasquez, former C-17 aircraft commander, 2,200 flight hours on type. I understand you have a Globemaster in distress. I need to speak to whoever is working that aircraft right now. There was a pause. A long one. Then a different voice came on the line, older, harder, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for the last several minutes. This is Senior Controller Ruiz. Ma'am, I don't have time for. I flew this exact aircraft type for 8 years, Elena said, cutting through with the same flat authority she used to use on final approach in bad weather. I know its systems, its limitations, and its failure modes better than almost anyone alive. If your crew is fighting something the manual doesn't cover, I can help. But you need to decide fast, because I promise you they don't have long. Another pause. Then, quieter, hold the line. The C-17 in question, call sign Reach 41, had departed a military airfield 200 miles north carrying humanitarian relief cargo and a flight crew of 4. 40 minutes into the flight, a catastrophic failure in the hydraulic system had crippled their primary flight controls. They were flying on a badly degraded backup system, losing altitude in slow, uneven increments, with an aircraft that no longer responded the way it was designed to. Every prepared runway within range required either altitude they didn't have or maneuvering they couldn't reliably execute. The crew had roughly 11 minutes of controlled flight left, by the controller's best estimate, before the degrading hydraulics failed entirely. Ruiz patched Elena directly into the emergency frequency, against the loud objections of a regional operations manager who kept insisting this was a military matter that civilian ground staff had no business touching. Reach 41, this is Denver Center, I have a former C-17 commander on this frequency who wants to assist. Stand by. The reply came back strained, breathless. Denver, Reach 41, we'll take any help we can get right now. Elena closed her eyes, and for the first time in 4 years, the cockpit came back to her in perfect, total clarity, every switch, every gauge, every sound an engine makes right before it tells you something is wrong. Reach 41, this is Vasquez. Talk to me about your hydraulic indications. Start with pressure on System 1 and System 2. System 1 is 0. System 2 is fluctuating, currently reading about 40%, but it's not stable. Copy. What's your manual reversion status on the elevator? We have partial manual reversion. It's heavy, but it's there. Elena felt something settle in her chest, the particular calm that used to come over her in the middle of every emergency she'd ever flown through, not the absence of fear, but the arrival of focus sharp enough to crowd fear out entirely. Good. That's your lifeline. Do not let go of it. I need your airspeed, altitude, and rate of descent. 210 knots, 4,200 feet, descending at about 600 feet per minute, and it's getting worse. Elena did the math instantly, the way she always had, numbers arranging themselves into a picture before she'd consciously finished the calculation. 600 feet per minute and accelerating meant they had somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes before the aircraft became genuinely unflyable. Reach 41, before we go further, I need to know what you've already tried. Have you cycled the hydraulic isolation valves? Twice. No change on System 1, System 2 stabilized briefly and then dropped again. Copy, don't cycle them again, you risk introducing air into the lines and losing what pressure you have left. What's your fuel state? 22,000 pounds, we're well over max landing weight for anything but an emergency. Understood, that's a problem for whoever inspects that aircraft afterward, not for you right now. Your priority is getting it on the ground in one piece. Can you dump fuel? Negative, dump valves aren't responding, we think it's tied to the same electrical fault that took out our primary hydraulics. Elena exhaled slowly. A landing at nearly double the ordinary weight meant a longer roll, softer margins, tires and brakes pushed well past what they were rated for. It made the highway option both more necessary and more dangerous, more runway needed, less airplane left to give it to her. Copy. Then we plan around the weight instead of fighting it. Reach 4-1, what's your co-pilot doing right now? Running the emergency checklist, working the electrical panel trying to isolate the fault. Good, keep him on that, but tell him not to touch anything on the hydraulic bus without confirming with you first. 1 system down is a bad day. 2 systems down because somebody flipped the wrong switch under pressure is how people die. Slow is smooth out here. I need you to actually believe that, even though everything about this moment is telling you to hurry. Copy, slow is smooth. Reach 4-1, what's your position relative to Interstate 25? A pause. We can see it. We're about 4 miles east of it, paralleling south. Elena turned to Desmond, who was staring at her with an expression somewhere between awe and terror. Get me a map of the interstate corridor between here and the base. Now. Desmond didn't ask questions. He pulled up satellite imagery on the office computer, and Elena leaned over his shoulder, scanning the long gray ribbon of the interstate with the same practiced eye she used to run over aerial charts before a mission. The southbound stretch, just past a wide rural interchange, ran arrow straight for nearly 3 miles, 6 lanes wide, with minimal overhead signage and no overpasses for the first 2.5 miles. It wasn't a runway. It wasn't close to a runway. But it was flat, it was long, and given the alternative, a controlled crash into open terrain or worse, populated ground, it was the only option that gave anyone on that aircraft a real chance. Reach 4-1, I want you to listen carefully, Elena said. There's a highway corridor 2.5 miles ahead of your current position, once you cross east of the interstate. It's wide, it's straight, and traffic can be cleared. Given your descent rate and your remaining control authority, I don't think you're going to make it to a paved runway. I think this is your best option. Silence. Then the aircraft commander's voice again, tighter now. You want us to land a C-17 on the interstate. I want you to survive, Elena said. I flew this exact scenario 100 times in the simulator, and I flew worse than this for real, in terrain you couldn't pay me to fly through again. You have partial manual reversion, you have engines, and you have a straight, flat surface ahead of you. That is more than I had the day I saved 2 men in a mountain pass with no working charts at all. Trust the aircraft. Trust your hands. And trust me. There was a beat of silence that felt, to Elena, like it stretched the length of the entire runway she'd never get to see them land on. Copy, Vasquez. Talk us down. Desmond was already on a second phone line to the State Highway Patrol, relaying Elena's coordinates and demanding immediate closure of both directions of traffic along the identified stretch. Word moved fast once the words, military aircraft, and, emergency landing, were in the same sentence. Patrol units began lighting up the corridor within minutes, forcing startled commuters onto the shoulder as sirens closed in from both directions. Reach 4-1, I need your airspeed and descent rate, continuously, every 15 seconds from here on. Don't wait for me to ask. 190 knots, 3,100 feet, descent rate 550 and holding steadier. Good, that's better. Reduce power gradually, not all at once. You're flying partially on fuel now, and abrupt power changes are going to fight your manual reversion. Small inputs. Everything small. Copy, small inputs. Elena talked the crew through configuration changes that existed nowhere in the standard emergency checklist, techniques born from years of pushing the aircraft past what the manual assumed it could do, adapted now for a machine that could barely respond to its own controls. She walked them through managing asymmetric thrust to compensate for the sluggish ailerons. She warned them, in specific and unglamorous detail, about the overpass structures ahead that the manual would never mention and that only someone who'd actually flown low over unfamiliar ground under pressure would think to bring up. There's an overpass 2.2 miles past your projected touchdown point. You will be well down and slowing by then, but if your flare is long, watch your tail clearance. I want you thinking about that now, not when you're staring at it. Copy, tail clearance at the overpass. The regional operations manager burst into the small office at that moment, red-faced, demanding to know who had authorized a ticket counter agent to direct a military emergency landing. Desmond physically stepped between him and Elena's line of sight to the monitor. "She's the only reason that plane has a chance," Desmond said, and didn't move. "Reach 4-1, once you're down, you will not have normal steering authority, expect the nose to want to drift, especially once you're past the point where your rudder loses effectiveness at low speed. Have your co-pilot ready on differential braking the moment you tell him to. Copy, differential braking standing by. And I want you thinking now, not later, about what happens if a tire fails on touchdown. At your weight, it's a real possibility. If you feel a pull to one side, do not overcorrect. Small inputs, same as everything else today. Let the aircraft settle itself before you fight it. Copy, small inputs if a tire goes." Behind Elena, Desmond had the highway patrol dispatcher on speaker, relaying updates in short clipped bursts. Both directions closed from the interchange south for 4 miles, all civilian traffic diverted, ambulances and fire units staging at the projected stop point. A second unit was already moving to physically block an access ramp that fed directly onto the corridor from a side road, worried that some confused driver might turn onto the highway from the wrong direction without realizing what was bearing down on it. "Denver, be advised, we have the field in sight, correction, we have the highway in sight," Whitaker's voice corrected himself, half a laugh buried somewhere under the strain, the small absurdity of the moment breaking through even now. "Never thought I'd call a highway a field. You'd be amazed what starts looking like a runway when you need one badly enough," Elena said. "Continue your descent. You're doing everything right." "Denver, Vasquez, we're at 800 feet, 160 knots, gear is down and locked, we have the highway in sight." "Good. You're doing exactly what you need to be doing. Keep your input small. This aircraft wants to fly straight, let it. Fight less, not more." Elena watched the numbers Desmond was relaying from the highway patrol helicopter feed now looping on a secondary monitor, grainy aerial footage of a massive gray aircraft descending impossibly low over a highway that had, minutes earlier, been full of ordinary Thursday afternoon traffic. It looked wrong in a way that made her chest tighten despite everything she knew about the physics of it. It looked, for one suspended moment, exactly like every impossible thing she had ever been told not to attempt. 400 feet. Speed 155. You're on profile. Steady, steady. 200 feet. Steady. Let it settle. 100 feet, Denver, we are committed. Copy, committed. Bring it home. The C-17 crossed the threshold of the cleared highway corridor at just under 150 knots, main gear touching down in a shower of sparks and tearing rubber that lit up the highway patrol's camera feed like a flare. The aircraft's nose stayed high for a long, agonizing moment, held there by hands fighting a system that barely wanted to cooperate, before settling. "We're down. We're down, brakes are holding. Maximum braking, don't hesitate on the tires are replaceable." The massive aircraft thundered down the highway corridor at a speed that seemed to defy the narrow gray strip beneath it, smoke pouring from overheated brakes, until, nearly 3/4 of a mile later, well short of the overpass Elena had warned them about, it finally, impossibly, rolled to a stop. The office went silent except for the ragged sound of Elena's own breathing. "Denver, reach 4-1. We're stopped. We are stopped," and, the aircraft commander's voice cracked, half a laugh, half something closer to disbelief. "All 4 crew, uninjured. We are down safe." The small operations office erupted. Desmond let out a whoop that startled the operations manager still lurking in the doorway. Elena sat very still for a moment, one hand still gripping the radio handset, feeling something crack open in her chest that had been sealed shut for 4 long years. "Copy that, reach 4-1, she said, and her voice, when it finally came, was steadier than she expected. "Good flying. Damn good flying." The footage was everywhere within hours, a military cargo aircraft resting on a closed interstate highway, its massive frame dwarfing the abandoned commuter cars still scattered along the shoulder, surrounded by flashing lights and stunned onlookers filming from overpasses at a safe distance. By evening, news crews were parked outside the regional airport terminal, and somebody, nobody was ever quite sure who, had leaked the detail that the ground guidance had come not from a controller, but from a former Air Force pilot working the ticket counter. The aircraft commander, a major named Whitaker, gave an interview that night that ran on every major network by morning. When a reporter asked him bluntly whether it was true that a fired pilot had talked them through the landing, he didn't hesitate. "I don't know what she was fired for," he said, staring directly into the camera. "But I know that every single one of us is alive right now because a woman behind a check-in counter remembered things about that aircraft that the manual doesn't teach you. Reckless isn't the word I'd use. I'd call it the best flying I've ever heard directed from the ground, full stop." The formal review Elena had never been granted 4 years earlier finally happened, not because anyone owed her an apology, but because it became politically impossible not to. The board re-examined the Mountain Pass incident with fresh eyes, this time alongside sworn testimony from the 2 soldiers whose lives she'd saved, and alongside a new, very public example of exactly what her particular brand of judgment was capable of when the stakes were highest. Her discharge was upgraded. Her flight certifications were reinstated in full. She was offered her old rank back, and a training command besides. The Air Force wanted her not flying combat routes anymore, but teaching the next generation of pilots exactly the kind of judgment that couldn't be taught from a checklist alone. Elena took the job. 6 months later, standing in front of a classroom of young officers who had grown up hearing her name attached to a highway landing instead of a mountain pass, she told them the same thing she used to tell herself on the long, quiet nights behind a ticket counter, back when nobody trusted her with an aircraft at all. "The manual will teach you what to do when everything goes according to plan," she said. "It's a good manual. Follow it. But someday, something will happen that isn't in it, and in that moment, the only thing that matters is whether you know your aircraft, and yourself, well enough to make the right call anyway. That's not recklessness. That's the whole job." Nobody in that room ever called her too dangerous again. Desmond came to her graduation ceremony from Training Command, sitting in the back row of a room full of dress uniforms in a rumpled sport coat he clearly hadn't worn in years. Afterward, over coffee in the officers' club, he told her he'd put in for early retirement from the airport. "Going to do something else," he said. "Don't know what yet. Guess I figured if a ticket counter could produce a pilot who lands airplanes on highways, it could probably let one old washout figure out something new too." Elena laughed, a real laugh, the kind that had been rare for 4 long years. "You didn't wash out, Desmond. You just landed somewhere quieter for a while." He considered that for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Maybe that's all any of us are doing. Waiting on the runway for our turn." Elena thought about that a great deal in the months that followed, standing in front of new classes of young officers, watching them absorb procedures and checklists with the wide-eyed seriousness of people who hadn't yet learned that the manual only covers the world as it's supposed to work. She thought about the 4 years behind the counter, the boarding passes, the quiet nights with a notebook full of numbers nobody else needed her to remember. She had once believed those years were only lost time, a sentence she was serving for the crime of being right in a way nobody could forgive. She didn't believe that anymore. Somewhere in those years, without meaning to, she had learned patience to go along with her instincts, the discipline to wait, to watch, to hold everything she knew in reserve until the exact moment it was needed and not 1 second before. It was, she came to realize, the one thing the old version of her had never quite had. The version who broke rules because she trusted her own judgment more than the system around her. The new version trusted the system too, right up until the system ran out of answers, and only then did she reach for everything else she carried. That, she told her students, again and again, in every version of the story she ever told them, was the whole difference between reckless and fearless. Not the size of the risk. The size of the reason.